Hello and welcome back to Human Physiology. So we are now moving on to Chapter 2, which more or less is going to be a review of a lot of the stuff that you probably discussed in your general chemistry class, whenever it is that you took that. There will be some information later in the chapter, especially that last item on the checklist, the macromolecules one. But some of the earlier stuff you may find to be too much review for you. So if we go through a particular item on the checklist that you feel already pretty comfortable with and you don't feel like you need any further review of that, feel free to go ahead and skip past that video and move on to a video that you kind of find more suitably addresses your needs right now. So the first item on this checklist is just a review of atoms and subatomic particles. So let's go ahead and get into this. So since a lot of this is going to be a review, I'm going to kind of accelerate the discussion here. So I'm going to try not to linger too much on any particular topic. But generally, the way a chemistry class starts is the discussion of matter. So matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. And that's going to pretty much encompass anything that we could possibly talk about in this class. So not only the kind of stuff that we are made of, like the DNA molecule you see here, but also the couch that you're sitting on or the chair that you're sitting on, the pencil that you have in your hands, your fingernails, anything that you want to think about is probably made of matter. So matter is going to be made up of what are called chemical elements. Basically, it's kind of a menu of all the different things that matter in the known universe is made of. So what is going to separate the kind of stuff that we as humans and biological organisms are made of versus, say, the kind of stuff or matter that your couch is made of or the air around us is made of, all has to do with which elements are incorporated and how they are incorporated. So an element, to go ahead and define that, an element is a pure substance that cannot be simplified or broken down, and elements come in individual units called atoms. So we discussed atoms in the last chapter in saying that it is the simplest unit of biological organization. So organisms can take atoms from the environment and assemble them into essential compounds and molecules like we were discussing. So molecules like water, carbon dioxide, and glucose. But elements themselves, elements like oxygen and carbon and sodium and iron, have to actually be obtained from the environment, meaning from the things that we eat and drink. So this graph that you see right here, or rather this table, just kind of gives a breakdown of what are the most prominent elements found in the human body and really in living organisms. So the general rule of thumb is that living matter, organic matter, tends to stick to what are called the Schnapps elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Those 6 elements make up about 95% of all living organic matter. The remaining 5% are going to be things that, as we go through the semester, we will come to appreciate, things like calcium and sodium and iron and chlorine and things of that nature. So if we look at how any atom, regardless of what element that atom corresponds to, atoms are going to be made of 3 different types of subatomic particles. So the first are called protons. Protons are a type of subatomic particle that resides in the center of the atom, which is called the nucleus. And protons have a positive electrical charge. Neutrons, hence the name, do not have an electrical charge. That's why we call them neutrons. They are neutral, and they are also located inside the nucleus, so they share that space with the protons. Electrons, on the other hand, kind of opposite to the protons, have a negative electrical charge, but rather than occupying the nucleus, they instead orbit around the nucleus in spaces called electron shells. Now, if you're going to consider these 3 different types of subatomic particles, we usually consider them on 3 different qualities. Electrical charge, so you can see protons have a positive 1 electrical charge, electrons are -1, and neutrons are 0. We consider them on their location. We said the proton and the neutron are located in the nucleus, whereas the electron occupies orbitals or shells around the nucleus. And then the third one that we have not yet discussed is how much mass does does each subatomic particle have? So each one is going to have what is called an atomic mass unit. Protons and neutrons are roughly equivalent. They have kind of arbitrarily one atomic mass unit. Electrons, the reason why the electron is listed as 0 here, it's not because it has no mass whatsoever, it's because its mass is so tiny in comparison to the proton and the neutron, it's mathematically allowable to assume that it has no mass, even though it does. It's somewhere between 1/5000th and 1/10,000th the mass of a proton or a neutron. So that's enough that we can just kind of pretend it doesn't have any mass, even though it really does. So what you're looking at here is the periodic table of elements. I like to think of it kind of like a menu that tells you of all the matter in the known universe, these are all the different elements that could potentially be part of that matter. We already mentioned how we as living organisms tend to be made up of things like carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen and oxygen, but any element on the list can be a part of any type of matter. So the periodic table is organized on the basis of elements and their atomic number. So you'll notice in the far top left, you have hydrogen has an atomic number of 1. Then as you move to the right, you get to helium at 2. And then back to the next lower row on the left, lithium at 3, beryllium at 4, boron at 5, and so on and so forth. So the atomic number is extremely important because that literally refers to one very specific thing. How many protons does that element have? So hydrogen has 1 proton, helium has 2, lithium has 3, beryllium has 4. How many protons an element has is what defines that element, right? So every element that has exactly 7 protons is going to be an atom of nitrogen. Every element that has 11 protons is going to be sodium. So that's just kind of strictly how it works. Now, looking at the periodic table like this can seem a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're in a chemistry class. But I'm here to tell you that for biology, really we only need to be concerned with a kind of small fraction of these. So in biology, usually we worry the most about the first 20 of these. So everything from hydrogen up until calcium. So there will be some exceptions to that. So iron at 26 is extremely important to physiology. Iodine at 53 is extremely important to physiology. So there will be exceptions, but for the most part, we don't need to worry about the elements that have exceptionally high atomic numbers. So like I was saying, each element has its own unique atomic number that no other element in the periodic table is going to share with it. Every atom of oxygen will contain 8 protons, and every atom of hydrogen will contain 1. But a separate issue is what is called the mass number, or atomic mass of the element. So the mass number refers to, for one atom of that element, or 1 mole of that element, how much does that atom or that mole weigh? How much mass does it actually have? So the mass number for an element is simply going to be the sum of the total number of protons and neutrons, meaning how many protons and how many neutrons does one atom of that element have? And the reason we do that is because those are the subatomic particles that have actual countable mass. You'll notice that we do not include electrons in that calculation. So for something like oxygen, which has 8 protons and 8 neutrons, if you add those two numbers together, you should get an atomic mass of 16 atomic mass units per atom, or 16 grams per mole. And then, as you can kind of, I'm sure, tell, as the atomic number increases, so as you go from, say, oxygen to sodium to aluminum to iron, and then all the way up to, say, something like uranium, these elements are going to become heavier and heavier because those elements will have more and more protons and more neutrons. So we mentioned that for something like oxygen, which has 8 protons and 8 neutrons, it's not always going to be that way. So every atom of oxygen is always going to have 8 protons, but every atom of oxygen is not necessarily going to have 8 neutrons. So atoms that are of the same element but have a different number of neutrons are called isotopes. And isotopes, even though they have the same number of protons, each atom of an isotope is going to have a different atomic mass because of the differing numbers of neutrons. A perfect example, as shown here, are the 3 isotopes of hydrogen. So on the far left here, you see protium, which is hydrogen 1. This is the most common isotope of hydrogen. Roughly 99% of all hydrogen is of this variety. So this type of hydrogen has a mass number of 1 because it has 1 proton and no neutrons. So 1 plus 0 is 1. That's its atomic mass. Deuterium is another atom of hydrogen because it only has the 1 proton. But here, it actually does have a neutron, so its atomic mass will be 2. Tritium, on the other hand, has 1 proton and 2 neutrons, so its atomic mass will be 3. So the important thing to note here is that all 3 of these isotopes are hydrogen because they all have exactly 1 proton, but they differ from each other because they have 0, 1, or 2 neutrons, meaning the masses of the 3 atoms are just going to be different. So isotopes are very important in medical technology, especially if we relate things back to the previous chapter, PET scans. So when we discussed PET scans, we said that a person will be injected with some type of radiopharmaceutical. Most of the time, these radiopharmaceuticals are going to be isotopes of a particular element that give off radiation, and we call those radioisotopes. The general idea is that for a particular element, the more neutrons that element has, the more neutrons that atom has, the more likely it is that it's going to be unstable and it's going to give off radiation naturally. And thankfully for us, this radiation can be detected in PET scans. So we used this as an example last time, but in this picture that I showed back in chapter 1, we have a patient that has been injected with radioactive glucose, in which those carbon atoms are carbon-14. Most carbon in the known universe is carbon-12, something that is not radioactive. But because carbon-14 has 2 extra neutrons, it actually does end up being radioactive. And this radioactive glucose accumulates in cancer cells, meaning that we can detect neoplastic tumors in someone if we inject them with radioactive glucose, provided that the tumors are sufficiently large enough to see. So for this person, you can actually see in the far right here 2 different types of tumors, one of which is the neoplastic tumor, and then presumably one that is metastasized somewhere else. So we've talked about protons and neutrons, but we haven't really had a whole lot to say about electrons. So most of the atoms in your body are going to be made up of molecules and compounds rather than individual atoms. So since we understand that molecules are made up of atoms that are bound together, we need to have a good understanding of which types of atoms like to bind with other types of atoms as well. So anytime you get the formation of a molecule or a compound between 2 or more atoms, you are talking about the formation of a chemical bond. A chemical bond is an attractive force that joins 2 atoms together. And like I was kind of indicating, not every atom can bond to every other type of atom. There are rules that we have to follow in determining which types of atoms can bind with other atoms. And as we're going to find out here, it has everything to do with the electrons that are going to dictate the behavior of atoms in determining this atom likes to form a bond with this atom does not like to form a bond with this atom. So we need to consider both the number and the organization and configuration of electrons in the cloud that surrounds the nucleus. So despite seeming kind of random and erratic, because you'll have seen kind of figures of electrons kind of orbiting and zooming around the nucleus, electrons are actually astoundingly well organized, and they are organized into what are called energy levels. The first energy level is going to be the one that is closest to the nucleus, and the rule here is that it can contain up to 2 electrons total. So on the top left here, you are looking at hydrogen. it has only one electron, so de facto, its one electron goes into the first energy level, that energy level being that first ring that is closest to the nucleus. Helium has two electrons, so again, we can hold both of those electrons in the first energy level, so we do not need any additional energy levels for those two elements, for hydrogen and helium. But for carbon and for neon listed here, carbon has 6 electrons and neon has 10, so having just one energy level is not going to be sufficient here. The first energy level can hold the first 2 electrons, but for carbon's 4 remaining electrons and for neon's 8 remaining electrons, we are going to need a second energy level that is located a step further away from the nucleus than the first energy level. And the general rule for biologically relevant elements, meaning the first 20 up to calcium, each additional energy level after the first can hold up to 8. Now, that stops being true after you go beyond calcium, but we're going to keep things simple and assume that that is true, and it is true for the first 20 elements. So, for carbon here, because that second energy level can hold up to 8 electrons, its remaining 4 electrons can fit comfortably in that second energy level. For neon, which has 8 remaining electrons after the first energy level has been filled, well, it's perfectly suited that that second energy level can just hold the remaining 8 electrons. So we do not need a third energy level for either carbon or neon. And a very specific rule that we have to follow here in assigning electrons is that the first energy level absolutely has to be filled before you can start placing electrons in the second. And then the second has to be filled before you can start filling up a third. So this slide right here, I kind of jumped the gun a little bit, is just going to kind of explain again why hydrogen and helium and carbon and neon are doing exactly what they are doing. But one thing that I did not mention that I should go ahead and mention here is I want to draw your attention for each one of these 4 atoms. Look at the outermost energy level. So for hydrogen and helium, it's the first energy level because that's the only one that they have. For carbon and neon, the outermost energy level is the second one. So for each one, we want to pay a special attention to how many electrons are in that outermost energy level. Or, if we want to rename it, the outermost energy level is called the valence shell. And the electrons in that valence shell are called valence electrons. And the valence electrons are going to be critically important for predicting the behavior of an atom. So speaking of the behavior of an atom, the atom is going to behave such that it fulfills something called the octet rule. And the octet rule says that an atom is going to react or behave in such a way that it tries to obtain a completely filled outer shell, a completely full valence shell. So for helium and hydrogen, to have a full outer shell would mean to have 2 valence electrons. For carbon and neon, having a full valence shell would mean having 8 valence electrons. It's called the octet rule because most valence shells are going to hold a maximum of 8. The only exception to this is the first valence shell, which can only hold 2. So again, hydrogen has 1 valence electron, so hydrogen is going to want to participate in chemical reactions such that it tries to gain an electron and fill that outer shell. Helium already has 2 valence electrons, it already has a full outer shell, so it is largely going to be chemically inactive. It's not going to want to participate in chemical reactions because that would spoil what it already has, which is a good thing. It already has fulfilled the octet rule. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, so if you're kind of thinking about this rationally, you could see it going either way. It could either pick up an extra 4 electrons to fill its second level, or it could get rid of the 4 that it has to make that second shell disappear, meaning it would only have 2 valence electrons in the first shell. Now, carbon's going to be a little bit funky, and we will address what carbon likes to do later on in the chapter, so don't worry about it too much right now. And then neon similar to helium, has a full valence shell. It has 8 in its second level, so it is not going to want to react with anything because it has already satisfied its octet requirement. So that is going to do it for this particular video. Join us next time and we will start talking about valence electrons and how they can predict what type of chemical bond is going to be formed between two atoms. So I will sign off for now, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.